This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The rain over Palermo fell like static, blurring the harbour lights into smears of gold and blood orange against the black water. Adriano de Rossi stood at the window of a private office 3 floors above a shipping company that existed only on paper, watching the storm roll in from the Tyrrhenian Sea, and did not know he had 11 minutes left to live. He was 31 years old, dressed in a charcoal suit that had been tailored in Milan, and he wore the de Rossi signet ring the way his father had worn it before him, like a crown too heavy to take off, even to sleep. In 4 days he would marry Serena Conti, uniting 2 of the last old-blood families still standing after the wars that had gutted Sicily's underworld a decade before. Everyone said it was a love match. Everyone was wrong. It was a treaty with a wedding dress. "The Calabrians want a bigger cut of the port," said his consigliere, an older man named Enzo, who had known Adriano since he was in short pants. I told them no. "Good," Adriano said, without turning from the window. "Tell them no again tomorrow. Louder." Enzo laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, the kind men make when the room feels wrong and they cannot say why. He would remember later, though there wouldn't be much later for Enzo either, that the security detail outside the door had changed without anyone informing him. 4 men he half recognized, instead of the usual 2 he trusted with his life. Adriano didn't notice. Adriano never noticed the men his uncle sent, because his uncle had spent 30 years teaching him that family was the one wall that never had cracks in it. The first shot came from a silenced weapon and took the nearest bodyguard through the throat before he could reach for his sidearm. The second took Enzo centre mass. By the time Adriano turned from the window, by the time the golden light of the harbour was still caught, reflected in his eyes, there were 3 men in the room who had not been invited. And Adriano de Rossi understood, in the last clear thought of his life, that the betrayal had come from inside his own blood. "Tell my uncle," he said. And his voice did not shake, because de Rossi men did not shake, even when the world ended. "That I know." The man who shot him did not answer. He simply lifted the gun and finished the job. And by the time the harbour lights blurred fully into rain, the heir to the de Rossi empire was a body cooling on imported marble. And 2,000 miles away, in a bar on Frenchman Street in New Orleans that smelled of bourbon and old brass, his twin brother was playing a slow blues riff on a battered guitar, and had no idea in that moment that he had just become the most important lie in the Sicilian underworld. Raphael Marchetti had never known his brother existed. He'd grown up in a shotgun house 2 streets back from the quarter, raised by a woman named Coco, who wasn't his mother, but never let him call her anything else. And he'd learned early that questions about his birth mother got you a long silence and a change of subject. He'd stopped asking by the time he was 12. By 28, he'd built a life he didn't hate. Gigs 4 nights a week, a small apartment above a po' boy shop, a voice that made rooms go quiet when he wanted it to. He was midway through St. James Infirmary when a man in a suit that cost more than Raphael's rent for a year sat down at the bar and watched him with an intensity that made the hair on the back of Raphael's neck rise. The man waited until the set ended. He was maybe 60, silver-haired, with a face carved from patience and something colder underneath it. Salvatore de Rossi, though Raphael wouldn't learn the name for another 20 minutes. "You play beautifully," the man said, in an accent Raphael couldn't place. Italian, maybe, filtered through decades somewhere else. "Thanks." Raphael reached for his water, wary the way a man gets wary when someone that expensive wants something from him. "Can I help you with something?" "Yes," Salvatore said. "I think you can help me with a great deal." He set a photograph on the bar top. Raphael looked down at it and felt the floor tilt. It was his own face, his own jaw, his own dark eyes, his own crooked smile caught mid-laugh. Except the suit was Italian, and the background was a marina Raphael had never seen, and the man in the photo was, according to the caption someone had typed beneath it in a family newsletter clipping, Adriano De Rossi, heir to Conti De Rossi Holdings, celebrates his engagement. "That's not me," Raphael said, though even as the words left his mouth, he was tracing the shape of that face, like it belonged to a mirror he'd never looked into. "No," Salvatore agreed quietly. "It's your brother. Was your brother." He let that hang, watching Raphael's expression fracture. "Adriano was murdered 4 days ago in Palermo. You are identical in every way that matters, Raphael, down to the mole beneath your left ear, I'd wager, which your mother always found so charming." He paused. "I need you to become him, for a while, perhaps forever." Raphael laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of sound, because the alternative was to believe him, and believing him meant a life he'd never asked for was about to swallow the only one he had. "I don't know you," Raphael said. "I don't have a brother. I don't have a family, man, not one that matters, and I sure as hell don't have some Sicilian empire waiting for me." Salvatore's eyes didn't waver. "You have all three," he said. "You simply never knew it. Your mother separated you at birth to protect one of you from a war she couldn't win. She died believing she'd saved you both. She only saved one." He leaned in, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle, which made it worse. "Come with me, Raphael, and I will tell you everything. Refuse, and men who are far less patient than I am will come looking for the only living proof that Adriano De Rossi can be replaced. I would rather you walk into this with open eyes than be dragged into it blind." Outside, New Orleans rain began to fall against the window, soft and indifferent, the way rain falls on cities that don't know a man's whole life is about to end, and another one is about to begin wearing his face. The private jet smelled of leather and money, and Raphael sat rigid in a seat too soft for the tension coiled through his body, watching Sicily's coastline rise out of the dark like the edge of a wound. Salvatore had told him everything on the flight, or a version of everything Raphael would come to understand much later, curated the way a man curates a story he needs someone else to believe completely. Raphael's mother, Isabetta de Rossi, had fled a marriage arranged for politics rather than love, pregnant with twins, terrified of a rival family that had sworn to end the De Rossi bloodline entirely. She'd given up one son to protect them both, split them across an ocean so that even if one line was found and destroyed, the other would survive, unknown and unreachable. "She died when you were 6, Salvatore said. "A car accident in Baton Rouge. I only learned you existed 8 months ago when my private investigators, searching for anyone who might threaten the succession, found hospital records that should have been sealed forever. And you didn't tell Adriano, Raphael said. It wasn't a question. Something moved behind Salvatore's eyes, quick, unreadable, gone before Raphael could name it. There was no reason to. Adriano was going to inherit everything. You were going to live your life, undisturbed, and never know what you'd been spared. He looked out the window at the approaching lights of Palermo. Then he died, and suddenly your existence became the only thing standing between this family and total collapse. So I'm what? Insurance? You're a lifeline. Salvatore's voice hardened, just slightly, the velvet slipping to show iron beneath. If the families we do business with learn that Adriano is dead, every rival who has been waiting a decade for weakness will move within the week. Alliances will break. Blood will run through the streets of 3 cities before the month is out, including, eventually, yours. You are not merely saving an empire, Raphael. You are saving lives. Possibly your own, eventually, if they trace you regardless. Raphael said nothing. He thought of his guitar, left propped against the wall of his apartment, of Coco standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, telling him not to go, of a life so small and so entirely his own that it ached now like a phantom limb. And if I say no? Salvatore's silence answered before his words did. Then I cannot protect you from what comes next. There are men in this world, Raphael, who will kill a possibility as readily as a certainty. You are, right now, a possibility that several extremely dangerous people would prefer did not exist. They took him to a compound outside the city, a mansion the colour of bone, walled and gated, and crawling with men who watched Raphael the way butchers watch livestock. For 6 days he barely slept. He was drilled relentlessly by a woman named Marisol, who had apparently been Adriano's speech coach years before, and who now looked at Raphael like he was an unfinished sculpture that needed to be corrected into someone else's shape. Adriano did not speak with his hands, she told him, slapping his wrist lightly when he gestured. He spoke with stillness. Power that does not need to prove itself. I'm not him. You will be, she said, without cruelty, which somehow made it colder. You have to be, for everyone's sake, including your own. They dressed him in Adriano's clothes, which fit with a precision that made Raphael's skin crawl. Every seam tailored to a body he shared without ever having earned. They cut his hair the same way. They taught him Adriano's signature, the particular cadence of his Italian, the specific coldness in his gaze that made grown men look away first. They showed him photographs, videos, recordings of Adriano's voice, and Raphael studied his own dead brother like a man memorizing a stranger's face for a test he couldn't afford to fail. On the 7th night, Salvatore came to his room and found Raphael sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his own hands, as if they belonged to someone else now. "There's one more thing," Salvatore said. "The wedding is still 4 weeks away. You will meet Serena Conti before then, privately, to allow you both time to, as they say, get reacquainted." "She's going to know," Raphael said. "The woman was going to marry him. She'll take one look at me and know I'm not the man she loved." Salvatore's expression didn't change, but something in his voice sharpened, quiet and certain. "Serena Conti did not love Adriano," he said. "Serena Conti agreed to a merger dressed as a marriage, the same as he did. What she knows of him is politeness, distance, and duty. You will not need to convince her that you love her, Raphael. You will only need to convince her that you are the man whose ring she is wearing. He paused at the door, and for just a moment, something almost like sympathy crossed his face. A performance, Raphael would understand far too late, as practiced as everything else. Try not to fall in love with her in the process. It would complicate things terribly. The door closed. Raphael sat alone in a dead man's room, wearing a dead man's clothes, preparing to steal a dead man's fiancée's trust, and somewhere in his chest, beneath the fear, a small and treacherous curiosity had already begun to stir. About a woman he had not yet met, whose photograph he'd found himself staring at 3 times that night already, unable to look away from eyes that seemed, even in a still image, to be searching for someone who wasn't quite there. Serena Conti had learned at 19 that grief and duty could occupy the same room without ever speaking to each other. She stood now on the terrace of the Conti estate outside Taormina, 26 years old, dressed in black silk that had been chosen for her by a stylist who understood that a Conti daughter did not simply mourn. She performed mourning, beautifully, for an audience that never stopped watching. Below her, the Ionian Sea moved in slow indigo folds toward the horizon, and somewhere behind her, in the house, her father was on the phone with the De Rossi family lawyers, discussing how a wedding could be delayed by a death without ever technically being called off. She hadn't cried when she heard Adriano was dead. She'd noticed that about herself, with a kind of distant clinical horror, that 4 days after the man she was supposed to marry had been shot to death in a room 300 miles away, she had shed exactly no tears, and instead had spent the intervening days wondering, guiltily, whether this meant she was free. She had not loved him. She could admit that now, alone on the terrace, in the particular honesty grief sometimes permits. She had respected him. She had been, at times, afraid of him. Not of violence. Adriano had never raised a hand to her, but of the particular blankness that lived behind his eyes when he looked at her, as if she were a column in a ledger he was satisfied had balanced correctly. 4 years of engagement, and she had never once seen him surprised, delighted, angry in a way that wasn't controlled, careful, curated for effect. She had been about to marry a man she didn't know, and now she never would. And the relief she felt about that fact disgusted her almost as much as it comforted her. Serena, her father's voice from the doorway. Matteo Conti was a broad man going soft in the middle, more banker than Don, despite the blood that ran under both titles, and his face carried the particular strain of a man doing math on his daughter's future in real time. "The wedding isn't cancelled." She turned. "Adriano is dead, Papa." The De Rossi family has asked for 4 weeks. They say Adriano's brother has been located, a twin, if you can believe it, hidden away in America his entire life, and that he will assume Adriano's position. The marriage will proceed as planned. Different groom. He said it the way he might announce a change in shipping manifests. Salvatore assures me the boy is being prepared. You'll meet him within the week. Serena felt something cold slide through her chest. "You're telling me I'm marrying a stranger who happens to share a dead man's face?" "I'm telling you," her father said, and his voice gentled just slightly, the way it had when she was a girl, and he'd had to explain why she couldn't attend school like other children, why bodyguards followed her to piano lessons, why the world she'd been born into came with walls she would never be permitted to see over. That our family's survival was never about who you loved. It was about what the union protects. That hasn't changed because the man's face has a twin wearing it now. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to throw something off the terrace and watch it shatter on the rocks below. Wanted some evidence in the world that things could break the way she felt broken. Instead, because she had spent her whole life being trained not to want things she couldn't have, she simply nodded. When do I meet him? Friday. Salvatore is hosting a private dinner at the New York penthouse, away from prying eyes here, where too many people remember Adriano's face too well to be fooled easily. You'll fly out Thursday. Her father studied her, something almost like guilt moving through his features before he mastered it. Give him a chance, Serena. Whatever else this is, it isn't his fault either. From what I understand, he didn't even know this family existed a week ago. She turned back to the sea, and for the first time since the news had reached her, something other than relief moved through her chest. A small, unfamiliar current of curiosity, dangerous and unwanted, about the stranger who would walk into her life wearing her dead fiancé's face and expect her to marry him anyway. She did not yet know that the man who would walk through that door in 4 days would look at her like no one in her entire guarded and gilded life had ever looked at her before. Like she was not a column in a ledger, not a merger dressed as a woman, but something he had not expected to want and could not, from the very first moment, stop wanting. The New York penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building on Central Park West that the Rossi family owned through 4 shell corporations, and Raphael stood at its floor-to-ceiling windows on Friday evening, feeling like an animal in a very expensive cage. "You'll be fine," Salvatore said, adjusting Raphael's cufflinks with the proprietary intimacy of a man dressing a mannequin. "Say little. Let her fill the silences. She spent 4 years learning to fill Adriano's silences. She'll do the work for you, if you let her. And if she asks something I can't answer, you deflect. You say business matters bore you tonight. You are allowed, Raphael, to be a slightly different man than your brother was, provided the difference reads as grief, not fraud." Salvatore stepped back, studying him with the eye of a craftsman assessing a nearly finished piece. "You look remarkably like him tonight." "I am not him," Raphael wanted to say, but he'd learned already, in 2 weeks of this new and terrible life, that saying such things out loud accomplished nothing except making Salvatore's eyes go flat and patient in a way that frightened Raphael more than any threat could have. The elevator chimed at 8 exactly. Raphael would remember for the rest of his life the specific quality of the silence that fell over the room when Serena Conti stepped out of it. She wore deep green, a colour that should have clashed with her dark hair, and didn't, that instead made her look like something carved from a forest at dusk, beautiful in a way that felt almost besides the point, because what struck Raphael first wasn't her beauty, but the guardedness in her eyes, the way she held herself like a woman who had learned, a long time ago, that rooms like this one were never safe, no matter how good the lighting was. "Adriano," she said, and her voice was low, controlled, giving nothing away. She crossed the room and extended her hand the way one might to a business associate, and Raphael understood, in that single gesture, everything Salvatore had told him about the nature of this engagement. 4 years, and she still touched him like a stranger. He took her hand. It was smaller than he expected, cool, and he felt something jolt through his chest at the contact that he had no name for and no right to feel. "Serena," he said. Her name in his mouth felt like the first true thing he'd said in 2 weeks. They were seated at a table set for two on the terrace, city lights sprawling gold and endless below them, Salvatore hovering somewhere just out of earshot, like a director watching his actors from the wings. For the first several minutes, conversation moved the way Salvatore had predicted. She asked about his recovery from grief. He gave careful, minimal answers. She filled the gaps with news about wedding preparations that had continued despite everything, out of some grim inertia neither of them controlled. Then she asked, apropos of nothing, "Do you still play?" Raphael's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "Play?" "Piano. You used to complain, the first year we were engaged, that your father never let you study music properly, that you'd wanted to as a boy, before he decided it wasn't a De Rossi pursuit." She studied him, something flickering behind her careful expression. "I haven't heard you mention it in years. I assumed you'd let it go, the way you let most things go." Raphael felt the floor of the conversation shift beneath him, a trapdoor he hadn't known was there. He had no idea if Adriano had ever played a note of music in his life, but he knew, with sudden and total certainty, that the true answer, his own answer, was the only one he could give without breaking something in his chest that had been guitar strings and bar lights and a life entirely his own until 3 weeks ago. "I still think about it," he said carefully. "More than I probably should." Something shifted in Serena's face, small, almost imperceptible, but Raphael saw it because he had spent 2 weeks learning to read every fractional change in a room for danger. She was looking at him differently now. Not suspicious, not yet, just curious, in a way that felt dangerous, in an entirely different register than the danger he'd been braced for. "You've never answered a question about yourself that honestly in 4 years," she said quietly. Raphael's pulse spiked. "Grief changes people," he said, which was true, though not for the reasons she believed. She held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, and Raphael had the distinct and terrifying sensation of being seen. Not as Adriano, not as an heir or an asset or an insurance policy against a war, but as himself, however briefly, however impossibly, by a woman who had no idea she was looking at the wrong man, and yet seemed somehow to already know something was different. "Adriano," she said finally, testing the name against him like a key that didn't quite fit the lock anymore. "Who are you now?" Raphael looked at her, at the guardedness cracking almost imperceptibly around eyes that had clearly spent years learning not to hope for anything from the man across the table, and felt the first true stirrings of a danger far more complicated than anything Salvatore had prepared him for. "I don't know yet," he said, and for the first time since stepping off that plane, it was the absolute truth. The gala was held at the Conti Estate's ballroom 11 days later, an engagement celebration reframed, with grim Sicilian pragmatism, as a memorial for Adriano that also happened to introduce his miraculous surviving brother to society, though of course no one in that glittering room was permitted to know the second half of that sentence. Raphael stood at the edge of the ballroom in a black tuxedo that fit him like a confession, watching 200 of the most dangerous people in the Mediterranean underworld drink champagne beneath crystal chandeliers, and understood with total clarity that if he made one wrong move tonight, he would not survive to regret it. "Smile less," Salvatore murmured beside him, disguised as pleasant conversation for anyone watching. Adriano smiled like it cost him something. "You're smiling like you enjoy this." Raphael adjusted his expression. Across the room, Serena stood beside her father in a gown the colour of dried blood, laughing at something a silver-haired man was saying, and Raphael felt a hot, unreasonable spike of something ugly move through his chest at the easy way the stranger's hand rested near the small of her back. "Who is that with her?" Salvatore followed his gaze, something amused and calculating moving behind his eyes. "Dante Ferraro, old family friend of the Contis, and the man who has wanted Serena for himself since they were both children. Harmless, mostly, though he's made his interest known more than once, much to Adriano's irritation." A pause, deliberate. "You'll want to manage that irritation better than he did. Adriano's jealousy made him careless, made him look weak in front of men who respect nothing but strength." Raphael said nothing, but he was already moving, crossing the ballroom with a stride he hadn't consciously chosen, and by the time he reached Serena's side, something dark and possessive had settled into his chest that felt entirely unfamiliar and entirely, terrifyingly, his own. "Adriano," Dante said, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we were just discussing how beautiful your fiancée looks tonight. You're a fortunate man." "I'm aware," Raphael said, and slid his arm around Serena's waist with an ease that surprised even him, pulling her a half-step closer, close enough that he could smell jasmine in her hair. "If you'll excuse us, Dante, I haven't had the chance to dance with my future wife yet tonight, and I intend to correct that." Serena's eyes flicked up to his, startled. Raphael saw it, the small flare of surprise, before she smoothed it into practiced composure. But she let him lead her onto the dance floor without protest, and when his hand settled against the small of her back, warm through green silk, he felt her breath catch, almost imperceptibly, against his chest. "That was unlike you," she murmured, as they began to move. "I've been told that a lot lately." "Grief," she said, echoing his own earlier excuse back to him, though there was something teasing in it now, testing. "Is it grief that made you jealous of Dante Ferraro just now? Because that man has never once threatened your position with me, and you've never once cared before whether he stood near me at a party." Raphael's jaw tightened. He thought of a dozen careful lies and discarded every one of them. "Maybe I've decided I don't like sharing what's mine," he said, and hated immediately how true it felt. Serena studied him for a long moment, the music swelling around them, the chandelier light catching gold in her dark eyes. "I'm not yours," she said quietly. "Not yet." "We're not married." "You will be." "Is that a promise or a threat, Adriano?" Raphael pulled her fractionally closer, close enough to feel her heartbeat where her hand rested against his chest, close enough that the rest of the ballroom blurred into meaningless noise and light. "It's a fact," he said, low, "and I find lately that I care much more about facts involving you than I used to." Something in her expression cracked open, just briefly, just enough for Raphael to see straight through the careful composure to the lonely, guarded woman underneath it. A woman who had spent 4 years being handled like a business asset and had apparently never once been looked at the way Raphael was looking at her now. Across the ballroom, watching from beside a marble pillar with a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, Salvatore de Rossi observed the way his nephew's stand-in held Serena Conti like something worth protecting, and something calculating settled behind his patient eyes. Not concern, not yet, but the first faint stirrings of a variable he had not planned for. Try not to fall in love with her, he had warned. He watched Raphael's hand tighten fractionally at the small of Serena's back, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who had spent his life reading weakness in other people, that his warning had already failed. 2 weeks passed in a blur of fittings, dinners, and careful performances, and Raphael found himself, against every instinct of self-preservation, seeking out moments alone with Serena, the way a starving man seeks food. They met, at her suggestion, in the estate's library on a rain-soft Tuesday afternoon, ostensibly to review the seating chart for the wedding reception. Raphael sat across from her at a long oak table strewn with place cards and floral arrangement photographs, and found himself watching the way afternoon light moved through her hair rather than the papers between them. "You're not even pretending to look at this," Serena said, not quite hiding her smile. "I'm terrible at seating charts, always have been." The lie came easily now. He had no idea if that was true of Adriano, but it was certainly true of him, and the lines between the two men had begun, dangerously, to blur even in his own mind. "You used to obsess over these details," she said. "You once made the caterers redo an entire menu because the wine pairings weren't precise enough." She studied him, head tilted, something searching in her expression that had become familiar over these weeks. The particular way she looked at him when the differences between who he'd been and who he was now became too obvious to ignore politely. "You've changed, Adriano. More than grief should change a person." Raphael's chest tightened. He'd known this moment would come eventually, had in fact been dreading and half hoping for it in equal measure. Some reckless part of him wanting her to see through the lie simply so he could stop carrying its full weight alone. "Maybe I have," he said carefully. "Tell me something," Serena said, setting down the place card she'd been holding. "Something true. Not something you think I want to hear, something real, about who you actually are right now, today." Raphael looked at her for a long moment, weighing every risk against a hunger he could no longer fully suppress. "I hate that this room smells like my father's cologne," he said finally. Which was true. Salvatore had been in this library that morning, and the scent of cedar and tobacco lingered in a way that made Raphael's skin crawl for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, even to himself. "I hate large rooms with too many mirrors. I miss—" He stopped himself. "Miss what?" "Music," he said, before he could stop the word. "Real music. Not the recordings that play at these parties. Something with a pulse to it. Something imperfect." Serena's expression softened into something Raphael hadn't seen on her before. Unguarded, curious, almost tender. "You never talked like this before," she said quietly. "Even when we discussed the piano, months ago, you spoke about it like a regret, something abstract. This sounds like—" She paused, searching for the word. "Like longing. like it's still alive in you, not something you buried years ago. Maybe some things don't stay buried, Raphael said, and the double meaning sat heavy and dangerous in the space between them. Serena reached across the table, slowly, and touched his hand. The first time she had initiated contact since they'd met, tentative, testing, like she wasn't entirely sure the gesture was safe to make. "I don't know what happened to you in Palermo," she said. "I don't know what almost dying, what watching your bodyguards die, did to you. But whoever you are now, Adriano, I think I like him more than I ever liked the man I was engaged to before." Raphael's throat closed around words he couldn't say. "I'm not him. I never met him. I don't even know what he sounded like when he laughed." And instead, he turned his hand beneath hers, palm to palm, and let the lie stand, because the truth would destroy the one real thing that had happened to him since Salvatore had walked into that bar in New Orleans and ended his old life without asking permission. "I like him too," Raphael said quietly, meaning himself, meaning the man he actually was rather than the one he was pretending to be, and watched something bloom in Serena's expression that felt terribly and wonderfully like the beginning of love aimed at exactly the wrong, or perhaps, some reckless part of him thought, exactly the right man. Neither of them noticed the library door, which had been left slightly ajar, ease shut a moment later, or the figure who had been standing just beyond it for the past several minutes, listening, before moving silently away down the marble hall. His name was Vittorio Russo, and he had grown up believing, for most of his childhood, that he would one day stand at Adriano de Rossi's right hand, the way his father had stood at Salvatore's, trusted, essential, one heartbeat from the throne. He was 33 now, sharp-featured and sharper-eyed, and he had spent the 2 weeks since Adriano's miraculous return from grief cataloguing every small wrongness in the man's behaviour with the meticulous hunger of someone who suspected, correctly, that something enormous was being hidden from him. He found Salvatore in the estate's wine cellar that evening, tasting a Barolo with the studied indifference of a man who cared more about appearances than flavour. "We need to talk," Vittorio said, closing the cellar door behind him. "About?" "About the fact that Adriano doesn't recognise half the men who served his father for 20 years. About the fact that he flinched, actually flinched, Salvatore, when Giuseppe Moretti greeted him last week, a man who used to take him fishing as a boy. About the fact that he speaks Italian now, with an accent that gets stronger when he's tired, an accent that sounds nothing like the Sicilian dialect Adriano grew up speaking, and a great deal like American English filtered through Italian grandparents." Vittorio's voice had dropped, urgent and low. "I'm not a fool, Zio. Something happened in Palermo, and whatever came back from it isn't entirely who left." Salvatore set down his wineglass with deliberate calm, though something behind his eyes had sharpened into focus. "You're observant," he said. "It's why I've always valued you. But I'd advise extreme caution before you say such things to anyone else." "Why?" "Because if you're right," Salvatore said, choosing his words with the precision of a surgeon, "then you're looking at something so dangerous that half this family would kill to control it, and the other half would kill to expose it. And either way, Vittorio, men who ask too many questions too loudly tend not to survive long enough to get answers." He let that settle, watching his nephew's face pale slightly. "I'm not confirming or denying anything. I'm telling you, as someone who has always protected you, that whatever suspicions you're carrying, you would be wise to carry them silently until I tell you it's safe to speak them aloud." Vittorio studied his uncle for a long, charged moment, and something in Salvatore's carefully neutral expression told him more than any confession could have. "You know," Vittorio said slowly, "whatever this is, you already know." Salvatore's silence was its own answer. "Is Adriano alive somewhere? Is this some kind of Adriano is dead?" Salvatore said, and for the first time in the conversation, something genuine moved across his face. Not grief, Vittorio noted with a chill, but something closer to satisfaction, quickly hidden. "That much, I promise you, is entirely true." He didn't elaborate further, and Vittorio, understanding that he had reached the exact edge of what his uncle would permit him to know, didn't push. But he left the wine cellar with a cold certainty settling into his chest that the man wearing Adriano de Rossi's face and sitting at the head of the family table was not Adriano at all, that his uncle knew this and had orchestrated it somehow, and that whatever game Salvatore de Rossi was playing, it was one that had already required at least one de Rossi son's death to set into motion. He thought, unbidden, of his own father, dead 6 years now, killed in a car accident that had never quite added up in Vittorio's mind, that Salvatore had grieved with the same practiced, hollow performance Vittorio now recognized from a dozen family funerals over the years. He thought of how convenient it had always been in this family for obstacles to simply disappear whenever Salvatore's ambitions required it. He said nothing more that night, but he began, quietly and carefully, to watch his uncle the way he had once watched Adriano, for cracks, for weaknesses, for the particular tells of a man who believed himself untouchable. He did not yet know that his instincts, sharp as they were, had only scratched the surface of exactly how deep his uncle's ambitions ran, or how many lives, including eventually his own, Salvatore de Rossi was prepared to spend to secure them. The nightclub was called Ombra, Shadow, and it occupied the basement level of a building the De Rossi family owned in Manhattan's meatpacking district, a place where the underworld's younger generation gathered to drink expensive liquor and pretend for a few hours that the violence funding their lifestyles didn't exist. Raphael hadn't wanted to come. Salvatore had insisted, a public appearance, he'd said, to reassure the family's younger allies that Adriano's spirit remained unbroken by grief. And so Raphael found himself in a private booth overlooking a dance floor drenched in red light, watching Serena laugh at something one of her old school friends had said, and feeling, for the first time in weeks, almost human. Then Dante Ferraro appeared at Serena's side again, smooth and confident, leading her onto the dance floor with a hand at her waist that lingered a half-second longer than necessary, and something dark and immediate ignited in Raphael's chest. "Careful," Salvatore murmured beside him, watching Raphael's jaw tighten. "That's a very Adriano expression you're wearing right now. I'd almost believe you'd grown into the role, except I know exactly what's causing it, and it isn't performance." Raphael didn't answer. He was already moving, weaving through the crowd with a singular focus that felt, for once, entirely uncomplicated by fear of exposure, because in this moment, watching Dante's hand slide too low against Serena's back, Raphael wasn't thinking about Sicilian dialects or family history or the 1,000 ways he could be caught. He was thinking about one thing only. "Mind if I cut in?" he said, and it wasn't a question. Dante's smile flickered, calculating. "Of course, Adriano." He stepped back with exaggerated deference, though something knowing lingered in his eyes. I was simply keeping your fiancée company while you were occupied with business. I'm not occupied now. Dante inclined his head and melted back into the crowd, and Raphael pulled Serena against him with a possessiveness he made no effort to disguise, one hand splayed at the small of her back, the other capturing her fingers, holding her close enough that the bass line thrumming through the floor seemed to beat in time with his own pulse. "You're jealous," Serena said, breathless, something bright and dangerous kindling in her eyes. "I don't like the way he looks at you. He's looked at me that way since we were 14. It's never bothered you before." She tilted her head, studying him in the red light with an expression that had become achingly familiar, searching, curious, drawn to whatever gap existed between the man she'd been engaged to and the man currently holding her like something precious. "Why does it bother you now?" Raphael's hand tightened fractionally at her waist. He should have deflected. He should have given some careful, Adriano-appropriate answer about pride, about propriety, about the optics of a De Rossi fiancé being touched too familiarly by another man in public. Instead, he said, low enough that only she could hear it over the music, "Because somewhere in the last month, without meaning to, I fell for you. Completely. And I can't stand the thought of another man's hands anywhere near what's mine." Serena went very still in his arms. "Adriano, I know that's not what this was supposed to be," Raphael continued, unable to stop now that the truth had begun tearing loose. "I know we were supposed to be a merger, a treaty, two families shaking hands through a marriage. But I don't want that anymore, Serena. I want you. Not the version of you that exists on paper. You. And I'm sorry if that terrifies you, because it terrifies me too." For a long moment, Serena simply looked at him, the red light and pulsing music and crowded dance floor falling away until it was just the two of them, breathing the same air, her hand still caught in his. Then she rose onto her toes and kissed him, not tentative, not careful, but with a fierceness that seemed to have been building for weeks, released all at once. And Raphael felt something in his chest crack open entirely, some final wall between the man he'd been pretending to be and the man he actually was, dissolving under the pressure of wanting her more than he'd ever let himself want anything. When they broke apart, Serena's eyes were wet, and she laughed, disbelieving, pressing her forehead against his. "I've spent 4 years waiting for you to say something like that," she whispered. "I'd almost given up believing you could." Raphael held her close, guilt and want tangled inseparably in his chest, and did not tell her the one thing that would have shattered everything. That the man she'd waited 4 years for had never existed at all, and the man she was falling in love with now had only been real for a little over a month. Salvatore de Rossi's private office occupied the top floor of a building in Palermo that few people knew he owned, windowless by design, soundproofed by necessity. And it was there, 3 days after the nightclub, that he sat across from a man named Corrado, the same man who had pulled the trigger in that Harbourview office 6 weeks earlier. "The Contis are pleased," Salvatore said, sliding an envelope of cash across the desk. "The wedding proceeds on schedule. The boy has performed better than I anticipated, better than Adriano ever did, frankly. He listens, He learns. He's grateful in the particular way that people are grateful when they believe they've been given a second chance at a life they never expected to have. And the girl? Something almost like satisfaction crossed Salvatore's face. Falling for him, genuinely, which is more than I ever managed to arrange between her and Adriano in 4 years of trying. It's useful. A devoted wife asks fewer questions than a dutiful one. She'll defend him instinctively now, should anyone begin to doubt. Corrado studied his employer for a moment. You planned this. Not just the assassination, the replacement. You knew about the brother before Adriano died. Salvatore's silence was answer enough, though after a moment he spoke anyway, unable, or perhaps simply unwilling, to resist the pleasure of explaining his own brilliance to someone who understood the scale of it. Adriano was becoming a problem, he said, sharp, independent. He'd begun asking questions about the accounting 6 months ago, about certain funds that moved through the organization that he wasn't meant to notice. He suspected, I think, that someone close to him had been skimming for years. He was 3 months, perhaps 4, from discovering it was me. Salvatore's voice remained perfectly level, discussing his nephew's murder with the same tone he might use to discuss shipping logistics. A man that intelligent, that independent, cannot be controlled. He would have investigated. He would have found the truth eventually, and he would not have forgiven it. So you found the brother first? I found the brother 8 months ago, precisely because I suspected I might need him. Salvatore leaned back, something cold and satisfied settling into his expression. Raphael is everything Adriano was not. Grateful instead of entitled. Uncertain instead of confident. He believes with his whole heart that I am the man who saved him from irrelevance and gave him a family, a purpose, a woman to love. He will never suspect that the family who gave him all of this is the same family that murdered the brother he's impersonating to make room for him. Salvatore almost smiled. A puppet who believes himself grateful, Corrado, is infinitely easier to control than an heir who believes himself entitled. I built myself a better heir than the one blood gave me. I simply had to remove the original first. And when he learns the truth? Because men like that, men who feel things as deeply as this one clearly does, eventually they find out. Salvatore's expression didn't waver, though something calculating moved behind his eyes. By the time he learns anything, Corrado, he will be married, legally bound to the Conti fortune, publicly established as Adriano de Rossi in the eyes of every family in the Mediterranean. He will have built a life around this lie so thoroughly that unraveling it will cost him everything he's come to love. The woman, the position, quite possibly his freedom, given the small matter of impersonation, fraud, and the legal chaos that would follow any public confession. He steepled his fingers. Men do not burn down houses they've spent months falling in love with living in, Corrado, no matter what they discover about the foundation. He'll swallow the truth, if he ever finds it, and he'll keep smiling, because the alternative is losing everything, including her. Corrado nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he understood, better than Salvatore perhaps did, the particular danger of underestimating a desperate man in love. "And Vittorio?" Corrado asked. "He's been asking questions." Something flickered across Salvatore's face. Irritation quickly smoothed away. "Vittorio is loyal. He simply requires occasional reminders about the cost of disloyalty. He paused, and his voice dropped, quiet and final. If that changes, Corrado, you know what to do. I've lost one heir already this year to a man who let curiosity outpace caution. I won't lose control of this family to a second. Outside the windowless office, unaware, Raphael was 3 miles away, standing on a hotel balcony with Serena's hand in his, watching the sun set over a city he had begun, despite everything, to think of as his, utterly ignorant of the fact that the uncle he'd come to trust as his only ally in this new and terrifying world was the very architect of the brother's death that had made his impossible new life possible at all. 3 weeks before the wedding, Serena found the photograph. She hadn't been looking for anything. She'd been searching Adriano's study in the New York penthouse for a particular cufflink box, something to complete the outfit he'd need for an upcoming gala, and instead her fingers had closed around a manila envelope tucked into the back of a desk drawer, unlabeled, forgotten, or hidden. She couldn't tell which. Inside was a single photograph, old, its edges soft with handling. 2 boys, identical, perhaps 4 years old, standing on a porch somewhere sun-bleached and unfamiliar, nothing like the marble and stone of Sicily. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, Adriano and Raphael, before the separation. God keep them both. Serena sat down slowly in the desk chair, the photograph trembling slightly in her hands, and felt every strange, unexplainable difference of the last 2 months click into place with a violence that stole the breath from her lungs. The accent that appeared when he was tired, the music he'd never mentioned in 4 years, spoken of now like a living, aching thing. The way he'd flinched once when an old family friend called him by a childhood nickname he clearly didn't recognize. The tenderness, God, the tenderness, so entirely unlike the careful, distant man she'd been engaged to for 4 years. She had fallen in love, she understood now, with a man who wasn't the man she was supposed to marry at all. She didn't confront him immediately. She sat with the photograph for 2 days, turning it over and over, testing the shape of the truth against every memory of the last 2 months, feeling something in her chest split cleanly in half. Betrayal on one side, and on the other, terribly, undeniably, the same aching want that had bloomed in her every time Raphael had looked at her, like she was the only real thing in his entire manufactured world. She found him on the 3rd evening in the estate's music room, a room he'd begun frequenting in the last few weeks, she'd noticed, though he always claimed he was simply thinking there. He was sitting at the untouched grand piano, not playing, just resting his fingers against the keys, with an expression of quiet, unguarded longing that she had never once seen on Adriano's face in 4 years of engagement. "Play something," she said from the doorway, and watched him startle, guilt flashing across his features before he could master it. "I told you, I never learned properly." "I know who you are," Serena said quietly, and watched the colour drain from his face. She held up the photograph, her hand steadier than she felt. "I found this in the desk. 2 boys, Adriano and Raphael, before the separation." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "Your name is Raphael." For a long, terrible moment, Raphael said nothing at all, and in his silence, Serena had her final confirmation, more damning than any words could have been. "Serena, is Adriano dead?" she demanded, her composure fracturing entirely now. Was he ever even— Did I fall in love with a lie built on top of a murder? Yes, Raphael said, and his voice was raw, wrecked, all pretense finally abandoned. Adriano is dead. He was killed in Palermo 6 weeks ago. I'm his twin. I didn't even know he existed until Salvatore found me in a bar in New Orleans and told me I had to become him or watch everything collapse into a war that would kill hundreds of people, including probably you and your father. I never wanted to lie to you. I have wanted, every single day since I met you, to tell you the truth, and every single day I was too much of a coward, because I couldn't stand the thought of you looking at me exactly the way you're looking at me right now. Serena's hands were shaking. Everything I felt was real, Raphael said, crossing the room to her before he could stop himself, though he didn't touch her, didn't dare, not yet. Serena, look at me. Everything I said to you, every word, that wasn't Adriano performing a role. That was me. That's always been me. I fell in love with you as myself, not as him. I never once pretended with you what I felt. I lied about my name. I never lied about that. You lied about everything else, Serena said, tears finally breaking free. And Raphael felt each one land in his chest like a physical wound. How am I supposed to know the difference, Raphael, when the entire foundation of who you are to me was built on a lie you were forced to tell? She left the room before he could answer, and Raphael sat alone at the piano his brother had apparently never played, his own carefully constructed life cracking open around him, understanding with total clarity that the one person who had made this impossible new existence bearable now knew the truth, and that the truth, once known, could never fully be unknown again. Serena didn't speak to him for 4 days. Raphael endured them like a man serving a sentence, moving through fittings and phone calls and Salvatore's increasingly probing questions about why the wedding preparations suddenly felt tense, all while carrying the specific, hollow ache of a silence he had entirely earned and had no idea how to end. He found her, finally, on the 5th evening, sitting alone on the same terrace where he'd first watched her from a distance months earlier, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air, staring out at the sea with an expression he recognized now, the particular loneliness of a woman who had spent her entire life being handled by people who claimed to love her while treating her like an asset to be managed. I owe you the whole truth, he said, standing at a careful distance. Not the parts I've been rationing out of self-preservation, all of it. And then, if you want me gone, I'll go, and I'll find some way to disappear that doesn't put you or your family in danger. You deserve that much, at least, after everything I've cost you. Serena didn't turn from the sea, but she didn't tell him to leave either, and Raphael took that as the only permission he was likely to get. He told her everything. The bar in New Orleans, Coco raising him without ever explaining why, the photograph Salvatore had shown him that first night, the 6 days of training and drilling and being remade into a dead man's shape. He told her about the fear that lived in his chest every single day, that one wrong word, one unrecognized name, one flinch at the wrong moment would expose him and get them both killed. He told her, voice breaking slightly, about the guitar left propped against a wall in an apartment 2,000 miles away, about a life he'd once thought was too small, and now understood with the clarity of grief had actually been the only life that was ever fully his own. "I should hate you," Serena said quietly when he finally fell silent. "You let me believe I was falling in love with the man I was always supposed to marry. You let my father believe the alliance was intact. You let an entire criminal empire believe a dead man was still breathing, all so a war wouldn't start." She turned to face him finally, and her eyes were wet, but something else lived there too. Something that hadn't been present in the 4 days of silence. "But I don't hate you, Raphael. That's the terrible thing. I've spent 4 days trying to hate you, and all I can think about is that when you looked at me, really looked at me, the way you have since that first dinner, that was never Adriano performing a role for the Conti family's benefit. That was you. A man I've never actually met until this moment, telling me the truth for the first time since I've known him." "Serena, I need you to understand something," she continued, rising from her chair, closing the distance between them until she stood close enough that Raphael could see the exact moment her resolve hardened into something fierce and unshakable. "I spent 4 years engaged to a man who looked at me like a line item. 4 years of politeness and distance and duty dressed up as partnership. And in 2 months, you, an imposter, a stranger who'd never even heard my name before 6 weeks ago, have made me feel more seen, more wanted, more real than Adriano de Rossi managed in 4 years of trying." Her voice caught. "I don't care that you're not who I thought you were. I care that you're the first person in this entire gilded, suffocating world who has ever made me believe I mattered as something other than a merger." Raphael reached for her, hesitant, half expecting her to pull away. And when she didn't, when instead she stepped into his arms and pressed her face against his chest like she'd been waiting days to allow herself this, something in his chest finally, fully broke open. "I love you," he said into her hair, the words raw and unrehearsed, nothing like the careful performances Salvatore had drilled into him. "Not as Adriano, not as some role I'm playing to survive. As Raphael Marchetti, a musician from New Orleans who never asked for any of this and would do all of it again, every impossible piece of it if it meant ending up here, with you." Serena tilted her face up to his, and this time, when they kissed, there was no performance in it at all. Only two people who had found, against every impossible odd stacked against them, something sheer enough to survive the lie that had brought them together. They stayed on that terrace long past midnight, the sea moving black and endless below them, and for a few stolen hours neither of them thought about Salvatore, or the wedding 4 weeks away, or the empire built on a murder neither of them yet knew the full truth of. For a few hours, they were simply two people who had found each other by impossible accident, choosing, deliberately and against all reason, to stay. Vittorio Russo had spent 3 weeks compiling evidence, quietly, carefully, the way a man builds a case he knows could get him killed if discovered prematurely. He'd started with dental records, a resource few people thought to check, buried in old De Rossi family medical files from childhood, records that showed subtle but undeniable differences in the man currently calling himself Adriano. He'd cross-referenced flight manifests, discovering a private jet that had flown from New Orleans to Palermo in the exact window between Adriano's death and his supposed recovery from the assassination attempt, a recovery no hospital in Palermo had any record of ever treating. He laid it all out, finally, not for Salvatore, whom he no longer trusted, but for Matteo Conti, Serena's father, in a private meeting at a cafe in Taormina where the espresso was strong and the conversation, Vittorio understood, could very easily end his life if it went the wrong direction. "I think your daughter is marrying an imposter," Vittorio said, sliding a folder of documents across the table. "I think Adriano de Rossi is dead and has been for months, and I think my uncle Salvatore knows it, because I think my uncle Salvatore is the one who arranged the assassination in the first place." Matteo Conti went very still. He read through the documents slowly, his expression shifting from disbelief to something colder, more calculating, as the evidence accumulated. "If this is true," he said finally, "and you're telling me this without proof of Salvatore's involvement specifically—" "I don't have proof of that yet," Vittorio admitted, "but I have proof the man is not Adriano. And I have suspicions, strong ones, that go back to my own father's death 6 years ago, a death that happened to remove the only man in this family who might have questioned Salvatore's accounting the way Adriano apparently started to before he died." Matteo sat back, jaw tight, processing the implications of what he was hearing. Not just a betrayal of his daughter's trust, but a potential vulnerability that could unravel the entire alliance if handled incorrectly, could start exactly the kind of war the marriage had been designed to prevent, if it became public in the wrong way, at the wrong time. "What do you want, Vittorio?" "Justice," Vittorio said, "for my father, for Adriano, but more immediately." He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "I want to know if your daughter is safe. Because if Salvatore orchestrated one De Rossi son's murder to install a puppet he could control, I don't think he'll hesitate to remove anyone, including a Conti daughter, who threatens that control once she learns the truth." Matteo's hand tightened around his espresso cup. "Serena already suspects something," he admitted slowly. "She's been distant, different these past weeks. If she's already discovered part of this, then she's in more danger than either of us realized," Vittorio finished grimly. "We need to move carefully. If Salvatore learns we know before we're ready to act, he'll eliminate the threat the same way he's eliminated every other obstacle in his path. Adriano, possibly my own father. He won't hesitate to add Serena, or her father, or me to that list if it protects his control over the family." They sat in tense silence for a long moment, the weight of what they were contemplating, exposing one of the most powerful men in Sicilian organized crime, a man who had already proven himself willing to murder his own nephew, settling heavily between them. "There's someone else who needs to know," Matteo said finally, "before we do anything else. If this man, Raphael you said his name was, is innocent in all of this, a victim of Salvatore's manipulation as much as anyone, then he deserves to know the truth about his own brother's death before we decide how to move against Salvatore. And if my daughter has genuinely fallen for him, as she seems to have, then keeping him in the dark any longer isn't protection. It's cruelty, and it's dangerous, because a man fighting blind is a man who gets himself and everyone he loves killed." Vittorio nodded slowly, understanding the shape of the plan forming between them, dangerous, uncertain, but necessary. Then we tell him, you said, before the wedding, before Salvatore has any more time to consolidate whatever control he's built over him. Neither man yet knew that Salvatore, watching every move within his family with the patient vigilance of a spider tending its web, had already begun to suspect that his carefully constructed lie was fraying at the edges, and that a man who had orchestrated one murder to protect his empire would not hesitate, when cornered, to orchestrate several more. In the 2 weeks that followed, Raphael and Serena moved through wedding preparations with a strange, aching duality, publicly performing the roles the world demanded of them, privately building something real in every stolen hour they could find. He learned things about her that had nothing to do with Adriano's 4 years of careful, distant engagement, that she'd wanted, as a girl, to study marine biology before her father redirected her toward the family responsibilities that came with her bloodline. That she still swam every morning in the estate's private cove, alone, the 1 hour of the day that belonged entirely to her. That she hummed slightly off-key when she thought no one was listening, a small human imperfection that made Raphael's chest ache with tenderness every time he caught it. She learned things about him, too. That he'd taught himself guitar from YouTube videos at 14 because Coco couldn't afford lessons. That he still called Coco every few days, careful never to reveal his location, terrified of what might happen to the only mother he'd ever known if Salvatore's enemies ever traced the connection. That he had nightmares, some nights, about a face that was his own but wasn't, staring at him from across a rain-soaked harbour. "Do you think he was a good man?" Serena asked one evening, lying beside him on the private beach below the estate, the tide moving soft and silver in the moonlight. "Adriano, I mean. Your brother." Raphael considered the question for a long moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "Everyone describes him differently. Salvatore says he was brilliant, ruthless, everything a de Rossi heir should be. Vittorio, when I've caught him watching me, looks like he's grieving someone entirely different than the man Salvatore describes. You've told me he was distant, careful, hard to know." He paused, staring up at the stars. "I think about him more than I probably should, considering I never met him. I wonder if we would have liked each other. I wonder if he ever wondered about me, before he died. If some part of him knew, the way I somehow already feel connected to a life I never lived." Selena reached for his hand in the dark. "I think he would have been proud that you stepped in to save what he couldn't," she said softly. "Even if the circumstances were monstrous, even if none of us asked for any of this." Raphael's throat tightened. "I keep thinking about who killed him," he said. "Salvatore's never given me real details, always deflects, says it was a rival family, a business dispute that turned violent. But something's never sat right about how quickly everything moved after his death, how prepared Salvatore already seemed to be, with the search for me, the compound, the training, as if he'd anticipated needing a replacement long before Adriano actually died." Something cold moved through Serena's chest, the weight of what her father and Vittorio had shared with her 3 days earlier, carefully, in a locked room, with instructions to say nothing to Raphael until they'd gathered more proof, pressing against her ribs like a stone she couldn't set down. She had promised her father she would wait. That exposing Salvatore's suspected involvement too early, without airtight proof, could get all of them killed. Could get Raphael killed specifically, the moment Salvatore realized his carefully constructed puppet was no longer blind to the strings. But lying here beside him, listening to him voice suspicions that edged closer to the truth than he realized, Serena felt the weight of her own silence becoming its own kind of betrayal. A mirror, uncomfortably, of the very lie that had nearly destroyed what they'd built together weeks earlier. "Raphael," she said carefully, "if you learned something terrible about your uncle, something that changed everything you thought you understood about why you're here, about who's really responsible for your brother's death, what would you do?" Raphael turned to look at her, something wary sharpening in his expression at the specific weight of the question. "Why do you ask that?" Serena hesitated, torn between her promise to her father and the growing, unbearable certainty that Raphael deserved to know the truth before it was too late to act on it safely. "Because I think," she said slowly, "that you should prepare yourself for the possibility that the man you've been trusting most in this entire nightmare might be the very person who orchestrated it." The waves moved against the shore in the silence that followed, and Raphael felt something cold and certain settle into his chest. The first true crack in the foundation Salvatore had spent months carefully building beneath him. The attack came 4 days later, during a routine visit to the Conti family's Palermo offices, and it happened so fast that Raphael would spend weeks afterward reconstructing the sequence of events from fragments, unable to fully piece together the geometry of violence that nearly ended his life. They'd gone to finalize the marriage contract's financial provisions, a formality, Salvatore had assured him, nothing that required more than an hour of Raphael's time. Serena had insisted on accompanying him, some instinct she couldn't fully articulate, telling her not to let him go alone. And it was that instinct, more than anything else, that saved his life. The first shot shattered the window of the conference room a full second before Raphael registered the sound, and it was Serena's hand fisting in his jacket, yanking him down and sideways behind the heavy oak table that put distance between his skull and the second round that punched through the wall exactly where his head had been. "Get down," she hissed, and Raphael realized, with a jolt of terrified admiration, that she wasn't panicking. She was moving with the trained precision of someone who had grown up in this world and had clearly at some point been drilled on exactly this kind of scenario. The gunfire lasted less than 30 seconds. By the time the estate's security detail breached the room, the shooter was gone, vanished into the crowded Palermo streets, leaving behind nothing but shattered glass, 2 wounded bodyguards, and a single De Rossi family seal, pressed into a scrap of paper deliberately left behind that made Salvatore's face go carefully, dangerously blank when he arrived 20 minutes later to survey the damage. "A message," Salvatore said grimly, examining the seal. "The Moretti family, most likely. They've resented our port monopoly for years. This is their way of testing whether Adriano's resolve survived Palermo intact." Raphael, still shaking with adrenaline, one arm wrapped protectively around Serena, studied his uncle's face and felt, for the first time, a flicker of genuine doubt about the story being offered to him. The seal seemed too convenient, too perfectly staged. A calling card that pointed exactly toward a rival family, and nowhere near the person actually orchestrating the danger around him. "We should increase security around Serena," Raphael said, his voice rougher than he intended, every possessive instinct in his body screaming at the memory of that bullet passing inches from either of their skulls. "Immediately. Doubled detail, minimum, until the wedding." "Of course," Salvatore said smoothly. "I'll see to it personally." That night, in the privacy of Raphael's suite, Serena sat wrapped in a blanket, still pale from the afternoon's violence, watching Raphael pace the length of the room with barely contained fury. "He's lying," Raphael said finally, stopping to look at her. "About the Morettis. I don't know how I know it, but I know it. The same way I've learned to read every fractional shift in his expression over the last 2 months. That wasn't a rival family sending a message. That was something else." Serena's chest tightened with the weight of the secret she'd been carrying for a week now, her father's careful instructions warring against a raw fear she'd felt that afternoon, watching a bullet nearly take the life of the man she loved. "Raphael," she said quietly, "there's something I need to tell you. Something my father and Vittorio have been investigating for weeks. Something I promised to keep from you until we had more proof. But I can't. Not after today. Not after almost watching you die in front of me." Raphael crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his. "Tell me." "We think Salvatore killed Adriano," Serena said, and watched the colour drain entirely from Raphael's face. "We think he's been systematically removing anyone in this family capable of threatening his control, possibly including Vittorio's father 6 years ago. We think today's attack wasn't a rival family testing your resolve at all." Her voice dropped, barely a whisper, the full horror of the conclusion settling over both of them like a shroud. "We think it might have been Salvatore himself, testing whether you'd survive long enough to remain useful. Or perhaps deciding, now that you're beginning to ask the wrong questions, whether it's time to remove you the same way he removed your brother." Raphael didn't sleep that night. He sat awake in the dark long after Serena finally drifted into exhausted, fitful rest beside him, replaying every interaction with Salvatore over the past 2 months, through the terrible new lens Serena had handed him, and watching, with a sick, sinking clarity, how perfectly every piece now fit into a shape he'd been too grateful, too desperate for family, too blind to see before. The convenient timing of Salvatore's search already underway before Adriano's death. The 8 months of investigation Salvatore claimed had located Raphael. Investigation that would have needed to begin, Raphael now realized with horror, well before any credible threat against Adriano's life had emerged. The way Salvatore had discouraged, again and again with careful, patient redirection, any of Raphael's attempts to learn more about the specific circumstances of his brother's assassination. Try not to fall in love with her. It would complicate things terribly. The words Salvatore had spoken that first night in the compound returned to Raphael now, with new and terrible weight. Not the warning of a protective family patriarch, but the calculation of a man who understood exactly how a devoted, grateful puppet could be controlled, and how inconvenient genuine independence, genuine love, might become to a plan built entirely on manipulation. He met Vittorio the next morning in a small chapel on the edge of the estate grounds, where Vittorio had arranged the meeting precisely because it was one of the few places on the property Salvatore's surveillance network didn't extend. "I need to see everything you have," Raphael said without preamble. "All of it. I need to understand exactly what he did to my brother and exactly what he's planning to do to me." Vittorio studied him for a long moment, assessing, Raphael understood, whether the man in front of him was still the pliable puppet Salvatore had constructed, or something else entirely, something dangerous now that the blindfold had finally come off. "Corrado," Vittorio said finally, "the man who pulled the trigger in Palermo. I've spent 3 weeks tracking his movements, his finances. 2 days before Adriano died, a payment moved through one of Salvatore's shell accounts directly into an account belonging to Corrado's sister. Payment for services never itemized, never explained, timed precisely to coincide with the assassination. He produced a folder, sliding it across the pew between them. And this, bank records showing Salvatore accessed the family's shipping accounts for years, skimming amounts small enough not to trigger scrutiny individually, but totaling, over a decade, more than $40 million. Adriano discovered irregularities in those same accounts 6 months before his death. He'd requested an independent audit. Salvatore blocked it twice, citing security concerns about outside auditors accessing sensitive information. Raphael's hands were shaking as he turned the pages, the full architecture of his uncle's betrayal laying itself out in cold financial records and shipping manifests. He killed his own nephew, Raphael said quietly, because Adriano was about to discover he'd been stealing from the family for a decade. And then he found me, kept me in reserve in case he ever needed someone easier to control. "There's more," Vittorio said, and something in his voice made Raphael's stomach drop further. "My father died 6 years ago. Car accident, they told me. Brakes failed on a mountain road he'd driven 1,000 times before. He'd been Adriano's father's most trusted advisor. He'd started questioning some of the same financial irregularities Adriano eventually noticed years earlier. I never made the connection until now, watching the pattern repeat itself. Anyone who gets too close to Salvatore's books, Raphael, doesn't survive long enough to expose them." Raphael closed the folder, his jaw tight with a fury that felt entirely foreign to the grateful, careful man he'd been forcing himself to become for 2 months. "Today," he said. "The shooting today. You think that was him too?" "I think," Vittorio said carefully, "that Salvatore may have realized you're beginning to think for yourself instead of simply performing the role he built for you. A puppet who starts questioning the hand controlling his strings becomes, very quickly, more liability than asset. I think today's attack may have been a test, or a message, or possibly a genuine attempt disguised as a rival family's aggression to remove you before you become too dangerous to control." Outside the chapel, the Sicilian morning moved on in golden, indifferent light, entirely unaware that inside its cool stone walls the truth had finally, fully surfaced, and that a man who had spent 2 months believing his uncle was the one person protecting him through an impossible nightmare now understood, with total and devastating clarity, that Salvatore de Rossi had been the architect of every piece of that nightmare from the very beginning. Raphael found Salvatore alone in his Palermo office that evening, standing at the same window where, 6 weeks earlier, in a different room but the same harbour view, Adriano de Rossi had spent his last minutes of life, unaware of the betrayal closing in around him. "I know," Raphael said, closing the door behind him with quiet, deliberate finality. "I know what you did to my brother. I know about the accounts he was auditing. I know about Corrado and the payment that moved through your shell company 2 days before Adriano died. I know about Vittorio's father, and how convenient it was for you when he stopped asking questions permanently." His voice was steady, colder than he'd ever heard it come out of his own mouth. "I know I'm not your family, Salvatore. I'm your insurance policy. A puppet you built specifically because you'd already killed the version of me who might have actually threatened you. For a long moment, Salvatore didn't turn from the window. And when he finally did, his expression held none of the alarm Raphael had half expected, only a cold, assessing calm that was somehow more frightening than any denial could have been. "You've grown into the role better than I anticipated," Salvatore said finally. "Adriano never had the spine to confront me directly, even when he suspected something was wrong. He preferred to work quietly, methodically, building his case before he acted, which, ultimately, is what got him killed. He gave me too much time." He studied Raphael with something almost like approval. "You, apparently, prefer confrontation. Interesting. I wonder where that comes from. Certainly not from me, and certainly not, I suspect, from whatever life you led in New Orleans before I found you." "You murdered your own nephew," Raphael said, fury bleeding into his voice despite his effort to control it. "You had him killed because he was about to discover you'd been stealing from this family for a decade. And then you found me. You found the one person who could replace him without ever suspecting the truth. And you used me. Used my grief, my gratitude, my desperation for a family I never had to build yourself a puppet you thought would never look too closely at the hand pulling his strings." "And yet here you are," Salvatore said, unmoved, looking very closely indeed. He moved to his desk, unhurried, and poured himself a measure of scotch with the steady hand of a man entirely unafraid of the confrontation unfolding in front of him. "Let me ask you something, Raphael, before this conversation goes somewhere neither of us can walk back from. What exactly do you intend to do with this knowledge? Confess to Serena's father that his daughter is marrying a fraud, orchestrated by a murderer? Go to the authorities and explain to them that you've been impersonating a dead man for 2 months in a criminal organization responsible for enough bodies to fill a cemetery? Run, perhaps, and abandon the woman you claim to love to the very dangers I've been protecting both of you from since the day I found you." "You're not protecting anyone," Raphael snapped. "You're controlling everyone. There's a difference, Salvatore, even if you've spent so long confusing the two that you've forgotten it." Salvatore's expression finally shifted. Something colder, more dangerous, surfacing beneath the calm. "Careful," he said quietly. "I have been remarkably patient with you, Raphael, because I genuinely believed, still believe, in fact, that we could build something valuable together. I gave you a life beyond anything New Orleans could have offered you. I gave you Serena, a woman who, whatever else you believe about my methods, genuinely loves you now, entirely independent of my interference." His voice hardened further. "Do not mistake my patience for weakness. I removed Adriano because he became a liability. I removed Vittorio's father for the same reason years ago. I would be remarkably foolish, having built this entire elaborate arrangement specifically to secure my position, to hesitate now simply because the current arrangement happens to be wearing a face I find useful to keep alive." The threat hung in the air between them, unmistakable, and Raphael understood with total clarity that he was standing in a room with a man who had already proven twice over that he would kill anyone, blood, nephew, trusted advisor, who threatened his control of the empire he'd spent decades quietly stealing from the inside. "If anything happens to Serena," Raphael said, his voice dropping to something low and lethal that surprised even him. If anything happens to Vittorio, if anything happens to me before I've had the chance to expose everything you've done, you should understand, Salvatore, that I've already made arrangements. Copies of everything Vittorio compiled exist outside this family's control now, with instructions to release them to every rival family, every law enforcement contact, every journalist who'd salivate over a story this large the moment something happens to any of us. It was a bluff, barely begun, hastily assembled in the hours since he'd left the chapel, but Raphael delivered it with a conviction that made Salvatore's eyes narrow with genuine, calculating concern for the first time in the conversation. You built yourself a puppet you thought would never question the strings, Salvatore. Congratulations. You were wrong. He turned and left the office without waiting for a response, his heart hammering, fully aware that he had just declared war on the most dangerous man he had ever met, and equally aware that there was no path forward now except through whatever violence Salvatore chose to answer that declaration with. Salvatore did not respond with immediate violence, which frightened Raphael more than an outright attack would have. Instead, the days that followed took on a taut, deceptive calm. Wedding preparations continuing exactly as scheduled, Salvatore's public demeanour unchanged, warm and paternal in front of the Conti family and the wider network of allies who had no idea what truth had surfaced beneath the surface of the union they were celebrating. "He's planning something," Vittorio said, meeting Raphael and Serena in the same chapel 3 days later, his expression grim. "I've confirmed it. He's moved significant funds through offshore accounts in the last 72 hours, the kind of movement that precedes either an escape or an elimination, possibly both. I think he's preparing a contingency in case his position becomes unrecoverable." "Meaning he's planning to kill us and disappear," Serena said flatly, "if he decides that's cleaner than continuing to manage the situation." "Meaning we need to move faster than he expects," Raphael said. "Vittorio, the evidence, all of it. Who else can we bring it to that Salvatore doesn't already control?" Vittorio considered the question carefully. "There's an underboss in New York, Silvio Greco, who's been quietly opposed to Salvatore's growing influence for years. Old grudges mostly, about territory disputes going back to their father's generation. If we bring him proof that Salvatore orchestrated Adriano's death and has been embezzling from the family for a decade, he'll have every incentive to move against Salvatore before Salvatore consolidates further power through this marriage." He hesitated. "But it's a gamble. If Greco decides the evidence isn't strong enough to risk moving against Salvatore directly, he could just as easily sell us out, hand the information back to Salvatore in exchange for whatever concessions he can extract." "We don't have a safer option," Serena said. "My father agrees. We move now, before Salvatore realizes exactly how much ground we've already covered, or we risk losing the only window we have." The meeting with Silvio Greco took place 2 nights later, in a private room above a restaurant in Little Italy that had been serving as neutral ground for underworld negotiations for 3 generations. Greco was an old man, sharp-eyed despite his age, and he listened to Vittorio's presentation of evidence, the financial records, the payment to Corrado's sister, the pattern connecting Vittorio's father's death to Adriano's, with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had survived decades in this world, precisely by never moving too quickly on anything. "This is compelling," Greco said finally, setting down the folder. "But compelling isn't the same as actionable. Salvatore de Rossi has built alliances across 3 continents over 30 years. Moving against him on the strength of financial records and circumstantial timing, even records this damning, would require more than evidence. It would require certainty that enough of the old families would back the move, rather than close ranks around a man who's controlled this family's finances for 3 decades.
What would give you that certainty? Raphael asked. Greco studied him for a long moment. A confession, he said, recorded, unambiguous, from Salvatore himself. Financial records can be disputed, contextualized, explained away by a man skilled enough at manipulation. A confession cannot. He paused. You'd need to get him to admit it directly, and you'd need to capture it in a way that couldn't be dismissed as coerced or fabricated. Difficult, certainly, with a man as careful as Salvatore has proven himself to be, but not impossible. Particularly, Greco added, something calculating entering his expression, if he believes he's already won and has no reason left to be careful.
The plan that emerged from that meeting was dangerous in a way that made Serena's stomach clench every time she thought about it in the days that followed. Raphael would return to Salvatore, apparently chastened, apparently willing to fall back into line, to convince his uncle that the confrontation in the office had been fear-talking rather than genuine defiance. That Raphael understood, ultimately, that he had nowhere else to go, and no choice but to continue playing the role Salvatore had built for him. And somewhere in that performance, wearing a wire that Vittorio had sourced through contacts neither Raphael nor Serena asked too many questions about, Raphael would need to get Salvatore to say, clearly and unambiguously, exactly what he had done. A confession extracted not through threat, but through the particular vanity of a man who had spent 30 years believing himself untouchable, and who might, if handled correctly, be convinced to gloat about his own brilliance one final time. It's too dangerous, Serena said the night before Raphael was scheduled to return to the Palermo office. If he suspects anything, if the wire is discovered, if he decides the risk of keeping you alive outweighs whatever use you still have. I know, Raphael said quietly, pulling her close, but it's the only path that ends with all of us still breathing, and Salvatore actually held accountable instead of just successfully avoided. I'm not doing this recklessly, Serena. I'm doing this because it's the only way any of us gets to have a real future, instead of just surviving in the shadow of what he's capable of. Serena held him tightly, fear and love tangled inseparably in her chest, and said nothing more, because there was nothing left to say, except the silent prayer that the man she loved would walk out of that office alive one more time. Raphael returned to Salvatore's Palermo office 2 days later, dressed carefully, the wire taped beneath his shirt, exactly where Vittorio's contact had instructed, his heart hammering so hard he was certain, irrationally, that Salvatore would somehow hear it the moment he walked through the door. I've thought about what you said, Raphael began, letting his voice carry the careful, defeated exhaustion of a man who'd spent days confronting the reality of his own powerlessness, about what happens if I try to expose you, about Serena, about Vittorio, about everyone who'd suffer if this all came apart. He met Salvatore's eyes, forcing every ounce of performance he'd learned over 2 months of impersonating a dead man into this single, crucial scene. You're right. I have nowhere else to go. I have no life left outside of this one. the one you built for me. If I destroy this, I destroy everything, including whatever future I might have with Serena. I don't have a choice but to accept what you did and move forward." Salvatore studied him for a long moment, something satisfied moving behind his careful eyes. The particular satisfaction Raphael understood with disgust of a man who believed he had successfully broken another human being into permanent, useful submission.
"I'm glad you've come to see reason," Salvatore said, gesturing for Raphael to sit. "It's a difficult thing, understanding your own powerlessness. But there's freedom in it too, Raphael, once you stop fighting the reality of your position. Adriano never understood that. He kept fighting, kept investigating, right up until the moment it killed him." "Did he know?" Raphael asked, letting genuine grief bleed into his voice, grief that wasn't entirely performance, grief for a brother he'd never met, but had come over 2 months to feel connected to, regardless. "In the end, did he know it was you?" Something almost fond moved across Salvatore's face, the particular fondness of a man recalling a memory he was proud of. "He did," Salvatore said. "The last thing he said to my men before they finished him was that he knew the betrayal had come from inside his own blood." Rather poetic, actually, for a man who spent his whole life believing family loyalty was an unbreakable wall. "It's a lesson I'd hoped you'd learn faster than he did, that loyalty is a tool, Raphael, not a virtue. I built this family's fortune from nothing more than my own intelligence and the willingness to do what needed doing, while my brother, Adriano's father, coasted on inherited privilege and called it leadership. When he died, I should have inherited everything outright. Instead, the old rules of blood succession handed his empire to his son, a boy who'd done nothing to earn it beyond being born correctly." His voice had taken on the particular heat of old, carefully nursed resentment. "I built this empire's actual wealth for 30 years, in the shadows, while men with softer hands and better bloodlines took the credit. Adriano was going to inherit 30 years of my work the moment he married Serena Conti and consolidated the alliance I engineered. I decided, quite reasonably, that 30 years of labor deserved better compensation than watching someone else claim the throne I'd actually built." "So you killed him," Raphael said quietly, "and replaced him with someone easier to control." "I killed him," Salvatore confirmed, without a trace of remorse. "And I found you, the one contingency I'd kept in reserve for exactly this eventuality, should Adriano ever become too dangerous to manage. It worked better than I dared hope, honestly. You've been remarkably obedient, right up until recently. Grateful, malleable." His eyes sharpened, something colder returning to his expression. "I do hope this newfound reasonableness of yours is genuine, Raphael, and not merely a more sophisticated performance than the one you've already been giving me for 2 months. Because I promise you, if I discover this conversation was anything other than sincere—" The office door burst open before Salvatore could finish the threat, and Vittorio entered first, followed by 4 men Raphael recognized from Silvio Greco's organization, followed finally by Greco himself, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who had just heard everything he needed to hear through the recording device relayed to a van parked 3 blocks away. Salvatore's face went through a rapid, devastating sequence of emotions: confusion, comprehension, and finally, as his eyes found Raphael's carefully neutral expression, a cold fury
that made the temperature of the room seem to drop several degrees. "You," Salvatore said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've been recording this entire conversation." "Every word," Raphael confirmed, standing, no longer bothering to hide the loathing he'd been suppressing for the entire performance. "Including your confession to murdering your own nephew, and your admission that you'd kill Vittorio's father the same way years earlier for asking the same questions Adriano eventually asked. Silvio Greco has heard everything, Salvatore. So has every ally he's brought with him tonight."
Salvatore's hand moved fast toward the drawer of his desk, toward, Raphael understood with sudden, cold clarity, a weapon Salvatore had apparently kept within reach for exactly this kind of contingency. But Greco's men were faster, closing the distance and pinning Salvatore's arm to the desk before the drawer had even fully opened. "It's over, Salvatore," Greco said calmly, stepping forward to survey the man he'd once considered, however grudgingly, an ally. 30 years of loyalty in this world, and you thought none of us would notice you'd been stealing from your own family for a decade, or that you'd murder your own blood to protect that theft. The old families won't stand for this once the recording circulates. You've made yourself untouchable in the worst possible way. No one will trust you enough to protect you now, and everyone will want the credit for finally removing you." Salvatore's eyes found Raphael's across the room, and for just a moment, something almost like respect flickered behind the fury. The particular respect a predator reserves for prey that has, against every expectation, turned out to have teeth of its own. "You were supposed to be the easy one," Salvatore said quietly. "The grateful one. The puppet who'd never question his strings." "You were right about one thing," Raphael said. "I am grateful. Not to you, never to you, but to my brother, for a life I never got to know him in, and to Serena, for showing me what it actually means to be seen and loved instead of managed and controlled." "You gave me nothing, Salvatore, except a lie and a murder to build it on. Everything real that came out of this, I built that myself, in spite of you, not because of you." The fallout moved faster than anyone anticipated. Within 72 hours, the recording had circulated through every major family across 3 continents, carried by Silvio Greco's network with the particular efficiency of men eager to distance themselves from a scandal before it could implicate them by association. Salvatore de Rossi, once one of the most powerful and respected patriarchs in the Sicilian underworld, found his allies evaporating with brutal speed. No one willing to be seen defending a man who had murdered his own nephew and stolen from his own family for a decade. Not when doing so risked their own standing in a world built entirely on the fiction of honor among thieves. He was found dead in a safe house outside Catania 6 days after the confrontation in his office. Not by any official justice, but by the particular unforgiving justice of a world that had decided collectively and swiftly that a man who had broken its rules so thoroughly no longer deserved its protection. Raphael never learned exactly who had given the order, and some part of him, uncomfortable as it made him, understood that he probably didn't want to know. He felt in the days that followed a strange and complicated grief, not for Salvatore, who deserved none of it, but for the brother he'd never known,
murdered by the very man who should have protected him, and for the 6 months of manufactured gratitude Raphael had felt toward his uncle before understanding the true, monstrous architecture beneath it. "You did the right thing," Serena told him, finding him alone on the terrace where they'd first admitted their feelings for each other months earlier, staring out at a sea that had witnessed the beginning and now the aftermath of everything that had happened between them. Exposing him, it wasn't just justice for Adriano and Vittorio's father, it was justice for everyone Salvatore would have hurt eventually if he'd been allowed to keep consolidating power unchecked. "I know," Raphael said quietly. "I just keep thinking about how easily I trusted him, how grateful I was for months to a man who murdered my own brother to make room for me. What does that say about me, Serena? That I was so desperate for family, for belonging, that I didn't see it?" Serena took his hand, lacing her fingers through his, with the quiet certainty that had, over the past several months, become the single most stabilizing force in Raphael's entirely upended life. "It says you're human," she said. "It says you wanted, desperately and understandably, for the terrifying new world you'd been thrown into to make some kind of sense, to have someone in it who was actually on your side. Salvatore exploited that. That's not a flaw in you, Raphael. That's a testament to how skilled a manipulator he was, and how much you'd already lost before you ever had the chance to protect yourself against him." Vittorio joined them a few minutes later, looking older than his 33 years, carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 6 years quietly grieving a father's murder and had finally, this week, seen some measure of justice served. Cold comfort, but comfort nonetheless. "The family council convened this morning," he said, "with Salvatore gone and no direct de Rossi heir except you, Raphael. They've asked for a decision. You could claim the position formally, Adriano's identity, the marriage to Serena, full control of the de Rossi holdings, the alliance with the Conti family intact. Or," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "you could walk away, reveal the truth publicly, accept whatever legal consequences come from months of impersonation, and let the family's assets be distributed according to whatever succession plan the council decides makes sense without a de Rossi heir at all." Raphael looked at Serena, searching her expression for some guidance, though he already suspected, from the steady calm in her eyes, that she had anticipated this question and made her peace with whatever answer he chose. "What do you want?" he asked her quietly, truthfully. "Not what you think you should want, not what your father would want for the alliance. What do you want, Serena?" She considered the question for a long moment, watching the sea move slow and silver toward the horizon, the same sea that had witnessed every pivotal moment of the impossible months since Raphael had first walked off that elevator wearing a dead man's face and looking at her like she was the only real thing in an entirely manufactured world. "I want you," she said finally, "not Adriano. Not the De Rossi Empire, not the alliance, not any of the power or protection that comes with the name. I fell in love with a musician who never asked for any of this, who spent months terrified of losing everything the moment I looked too closely at him. I don't need you to be an heir, Raphael. I just need you to be here, with me, however that ends up looking once all the dust settles." Raphael felt something in his chest loosen, the particular relief of a man who had spent months bracing for an impossible choice, only to discover the woman he loved had already made the choice simple. by refusing to ask him to sacrifice himself for a name and a fortune that had never actually belonged to him in the first place. "Then I know what I want to do," Raphael said, and for the first time in months, the decision felt entirely, uncomplicatedly his own. The wedding, when it finally happened 3 months later, looked nothing like the elaborate political merger that had originally been planned.
Raphael had told the truth publicly, carefully, strategically, with legal counsel Matteo Conti had insisted on providing, framing the impersonation not as fraud, but as a desperate, coerced act undertaken to prevent exactly the kind of violent power vacuum that had ultimately claimed Salvatore's life anyway. The legal consequences had been serious but survivable, a period of intense scrutiny, a formal separation from any claim to the De Rossi criminal enterprise, a public reckoning that had, paradoxically, made Raphael more trusted among the old families than Adriano's careful, guarded persona ever had been. A man who told the truth about an impossible situation, it turned out, earned more respect in that world than a man who had spent his whole life performing an inherited role flawlessly. The De Rossi holdings had been restructured under new leadership, legitimate business interests separated, finally and permanently, from the criminal enterprise Salvatore had spent decades building. A slow but genuine transition towards something closer to the ordinary life Raphael had once believed was lost to him forever. Vittorio, respected now for his role in exposing his uncle's crimes, had taken a leadership position in what remained of the legitimate operations, insisting Raphael and Serena be permitted to build a life outside the underworld entirely if that was what they wanted. And it was. They were married on the same terrace where Raphael had first admitted his feelings, overlooking the same sea that had witnessed everything. No crystal chandeliers, no calculated political alliance dressed as celebration, just close family and the particular joy of two people who had found each other through impossible, terrible circumstances and chosen, deliberately, to stay. Coco flew in from New Orleans for the ceremony, crying through most of it, gripping Raphael's hand afterward with fierce, disbelieving pride. "I always knew there was something different about you," she told him, dabbing at her eyes. "Never figured it'd turn out to be a whole secret twin brother and an Italian crime family. But I always knew you were meant for something bigger than that little apartment above the po' boy shop." Raphael laughed, real and unguarded, in a way that felt, finally, entirely his own. "I think I've had enough something bigger for one lifetime, Coco. I'm hoping for something quieter from here on out." Serena found him later that evening, away from the reception, standing at the edge of the terrace with a guitar in his hands, the same one Coco had brought with her, without being asked, understanding better than anyone what her boy actually needed for this particular celebration. "Play something," Serena said, echoing the words she'd spoken to him in the music room months earlier, back when the truth between them had still been a wound instead of a foundation. This time, Raphael didn't hesitate. He played something slow and unpolished, a little imperfect, entirely his own. No performance in it at all, nothing borrowed from a brother he'd never met, or a role he'd never asked to play. Just Raphael Marchetti, a musician from New Orleans who had somehow, against every impossible odd, found his way to a life more real than the one he'd left behind, sitting on a terrace, overlooking the Ionian Sea, with the woman he loved, watching him with an expression that held no guardedness at all anymore, only the particular, unguarded joy of someone who had finally, after a lifetime of careful distance, allowed herself to be fully seen and fully loved in return. "I love you," she said when the song ended,
sitting down beside him, resting her head against his shoulder as the last of the sunset burned gold and rose across the water. Not Adriana, not the air, not the name, not any of the things this world tried to force you into being. You, just you, exactly as you are.
Raphael set the guitar aside and pulled her close, feeling the particular, hard-won peace of a man who had walked through an impossible fire and come out the other side with everything that actually mattered still intact. "I love you too," he said quietly, and for the first time since Salvatore walked into that bar in New Orleans, I finally feel like the life I'm living is actually mine. Behind them, the wedding reception continued, laughter and music drifting across the terrace, a family rebuilding itself from the wreckage of one man's ambition into something that finally, tentatively, resembled the kind of home neither of them had ever quite believed they deserved. Ahead of them, the sea moved dark and endless toward a horizon neither could fully see, uncertain in the way all real futures are uncertain, but theirs, chosen freely, built on truth instead of lies, belonging to no one and nothing except the two people who had found each other by impossible accident and refused, against every danger stacked against them, to let go. It was not the ending either of them had expected when a dead man's face first walked into a stranger's life and asked her to love a lie. But it was, they both understood, sitting together in the fading light, exactly the ending they had chosen for themselves, real, imperfect, and entirely, finally, their own.